The last thing I remembered from my first life was discovering that the son I had loved and raised for years was not mine, but the product of my wife's affair. The moment I opened my eyes again, I was back in my own home, and my wife, Sarah, was standing before me, holding that same little boy's hand. She gave me a hopeful smile and asked, "Honey, can we adopt him?" I looked from her to the child and then back to her, my voice steady and devoid of the warmth she expected. "No," I said calmly. "Let your mother adopt him. That way he can be your brother." The day of the crash was meant to be a happy one, a family picnic. Sarah was driving, and I was in the back seat with our son, Daniel. Just as we were about to leave a long tunnel, Daniel mentioned that his door felt like it wasn't closed properly. Without giving it a second thought, I unbuckled my seatbelt and leaned over to check it for him. Before I could even figure out what was wrong, the car swerved violently and lost control, crashing into the guardrail. My immediate instinct was to cover Daniel, shielding him with my own body as the windows shattered. But without my seatbelt on, the force of the impact threw me from the vehicle as it tumbled off the side of the highway. As I lay on the ground, life fading from me, I overheard a conversation that froze the blood in my veins. "Is he dead, Mom?" Daniel asked, his voice clear and untroubled. "Don't worry, he's definitely dead," Sarah replied, her tone as cold and distant as a stranger's. "Great," the boy said. "Can we bring my real dad home now?" "Not just yet," she answered. "We have to deal with his funeral first." "Oh, right. And then there's the insurance money, Mom. Once we get that, let's take a trip abroad. Dad always wanted to see Korea." "Of course. Whatever you and your dad want." My rage was immense, but it was powerless against the darkness closing in. I closed my eyes against my will, accepting my fate. It must have been some form of cosmic pity that I found myself reborn, sent back to the very day Sarah first brought Daniel into our home. This time, I had the power to change everything. It was the 7th year of our marriage, and Sarah had just returned from what she called a business trip, with a small boy in tow. It was the same Daniel I had cherished in my previous life. Seeing how comfortable and familiar my mother-in-law, Helen, was with the boy, I could only laugh to myself with a deep, bitter irony. It seemed everyone had been in on the secret, but me. Sarah passed the boy to her mother and led me into the living room. "Alex," she began, "I want to talk to you about something." She proceeded to tell me a heart-wrenching story about Daniel's tragic life. He was 5 years old, with no known parents, and had been raised by his grandmother who had recently passed away, leaving him an orphan without a home. She claimed she felt an overwhelming pity for the child and had to bring him back with her. In my past life, I had been deeply moved by this tale and had readily agreed to the adoption, even praising Sarah for her incredible kindness. But now, armed with the terrible truth, I had no intention of playing along with her script. She continued her performance, her expression a careful mix of compassion and conflict, all designed to persuade me. "Honey, can we adopt him?" she asked again, her voice soft. As she spoke, I saw her mother peeking into the room, her timing almost comically perfect. I offered Helen a small smile before turning back to my wife. My voice was gentle, but my words were sharp. "No, let your mom adopt him. He can be your brother." Sarah's face contorted as if she had swallowed something foul, completely taken aback by my response. "Don't say that," she stammered. "Mom is too old to raise a child." From the other room, Helen listened nervously, having heard our entire exchange. Before they could formulate another argument, I rubbed my temples, feigning exhaustion. "I'm tired. I'm going to bed." Lying in the dark, sleep was the furthest thing from my mind. I couldn't comprehend how I had been so blind to the malice of the woman sleeping in the bed we shared. The fact that Daniel was already 5 years old meant she must have cheated on me almost immediately after our wedding day. Sarah's father had passed away when she was young, and her mother had raised her alone. When we first met, her family was still struggling with debt. I hadn't cared about any of that because Sarah had seemed so sincere and good-hearted. We had mutually agreed to focus on our careers for a few years after getting married and to postpone having children. Then, Daniel appeared. He was a well-behaved and adorable child who seemed genuinely innocent, and I had welcomed him into my life without hesitation. Later, when I expressed my desire for us to have a child of our own, Daniel's behavior took a dramatic turn. He would act out, running away from home on several occasions and having a few near-miss accidents that terrified me. Helen would pack her bags in tears, threatening to move back to the countryside if they were being a burden. Sarah, playing the part of the torn wife and daughter, would insist that we wait until Daniel was older and more settled before having another child. The constant emotional turmoil drove me to the brink of a mental breakdown. Looking back on it all now, it was clear that it had been a meticulously crafted scheme to ruin my life. A tear slid down my cheek in the darkness. The car accident, the insurance policies, it was all designed to kill me and take my money. Had this been their plan from the very beginning? And who was this real father that Daniel had mentioned? It was Saturday, and I woke up early. Daniel was already sitting quietly on the living room sofa. When he saw me, he greeted me politely. "Hello, Uncle." I stood there for a long moment, just looking at him, before I reached out and pinched his cheek. The boy froze, not daring to move an inch. Sarah saw what I was doing and looked startled, rushing over to intervene. "Alex, hurry up and get some breakfast." I released his cheek, leaving a faint red mark on the soft skin. "Such a cute child," I said with an ambiguous smile. I could see the poorly hidden concern in Sarah's eyes as she went to comfort him, patting his head before setting him up at the table for breakfast. After we ate, Sarah broached the subject of the adoption once more. "I'll think about it," I replied nonchalantly, grabbing my coat and heading for the door. Once I was out of the house, I drove to the city library. Sarah had always loved this place, which still used an old-fashioned system where each borrowed book had a physical card inside, stamped with the names of previous borrowers and the dates. My plan was to search the children's section. In my past life, Daniel had often talked about classic children's books he claimed to have read at a neighbor's house. I had a strong suspicion that Daniel's reading habits were connected to Sarah. She used to lend me her library card, so I was somewhat familiar with the types of books she borrowed. I reasoned that perhaps the books weren't borrowed for her, but for his real father. I began meticulously checking the borrower's cards in various children's books, searching for any names that appeared consistently alongside books Daniel had loved. Among the many unfamiliar names, one stood out and made my heart pound. Mark. It had to be him. I knew a single name wasn't definitive proof, but it was a start. I needed more evidence. When I arrived back home, Helen was in the kitchen cooking. I didn't offer to help as I normally would have. I had never been one to do much housework. We typically had a maid. However, since Helen had moved in, she insisted on doing the chores herself, claiming she was saving us money. After some persuasive arguments from Sarah, I had reluctantly let the maid go. "Alex, Mom just feels that since this is your house, doing some chores will make her feel more at ease," Sarah had explained. It was true that our marital home had been purchased by my parents and was still legally in their names. Sarah's explanation sounded reasonable on the surface, but Helen was her mother, not mine, and I never felt comfortable ordering her around. Consequently, whenever I came home from work and saw her cooking, I would always step in to help. In the end, I was the one doing most of the work. But today, I simply had no desire to help. Helen was clearly annoyed, and the sounds of her cooking grew louder and more aggressive. After dinner, as Helen was washing the dishes with a great deal of clatter, Daniel spoke up sweetly. "Uncle, Auntie, I'll help Nana wash the dishes. I do it all the time at home." I patted the boy's head. "No, you shouldn't call her that. Helen is still very young. Calling her Nana makes her sound old." Daniel, being only 5, didn't understand the subtext and looked nervous, hiding behind Sarah. Just then, Helen came out of the kitchen, rubbing her back and complaining about how old and sore she was. I wasn't falling for the act. I played along, feigning ignorance. "Yes, I suppose you do look a bit older these days. The boy wasn't really wrong with that Nana comment." Helen's lips twitched. I had finally acknowledged her as the child's grandmother, so she was worried I'd retract that if she protested, but agreeing with me still stung her pride. She had her own child early in life and wasn't particularly old. Over the years, living with us had improved her lifestyle, and she enjoyed dressing up and being complimented on her youthful appearance. Being called an old lady did not sit well with her at all. Sarah saw an opening and jumped in. "Alex, so you've agreed to adopt Daniel. Let's sit down and discuss the details." "There's no need," I said. "I have a friend who is familiar with adoption procedures. I'll just take the necessary documents to him." Sarah knew that most of my friends held senior positions in their fields, so she relaxed. Thinking about the name on the documents, she asked casually, "So, the boy has your last name, I assume?" Her smile faltered slightly as she grew cautious. She nodded. "Yes." "Whose name is it? The father's or the mother's?" "The grandmother's," she replied, an answer she seemed to have prepared. "She raised him by herself." "So he doesn't want a new name. He'd prefer to keep his own, correct?" "Yes, that sounds right," she agreed. "You're the best, Alex. So kind-hearted," she said, leaning in to hug me. I sidestepped her, leaving her standing there with an awkward smile. I excused myself and went into the bathroom, locking the door behind me. I pulled out my phone. I had previously paid for a monitoring program to be installed on Sarah's phone. I eagerly checked her messages and call logs. Among a list of nearly 4,000 contacts, I found a familiar name, Mark. He was listed simply as a colleague, and there were no chat logs between them on her primary messaging app. My hand trembled slightly as I clenched my fist, trying to calm myself before clicking on his account profile. His profile picture was of him, and his posts were just ordinary pictures of his daily life, with no sign of a child. But I was certain. There were no coincidences in this. Early Sunday morning, Sarah was called into the office for an emergency. She barely had time for a bite of breakfast before she rushed out. Helen watched my leisurely pace at the table and couldn't help but make a snide remark. "Sarah really has it tough, doesn't she? Can't even get a break on the weekend. You're the lucky one." I swallowed a piece of toast and smiled brightly at her. "Well, it's all because I graduated from a good university. I can't help it if I have a lucky life. Sarah has her limitations, and you weren't able to provide much support for her, so working hard is her only option." Helen's face flushed red, and her chopsticks froze in mid-air. She wanted to argue, but she couldn't. Everything I had said was the truth. I had just never been so blunt about it before. After breakfast, I drove to my parents' house. I had almost forgotten the date until my mother called to remind me. Today was the day my parents had decided to officially transfer the ownership of our house to Sarah and me. Although Sarah had never explicitly said anything, her actions had always shown how much it mattered to her. Whenever she was out at parties or working late, she would tell me she felt uncomfortable living in a house that belonged to my parents and that she wanted to give me a real home of our own. I was so touched by her words back then, telling her not to think that way and that my parents never looked down on her. Plus, as their only child, everything would eventually be mine anyway. But she was persistent, always working herself to the bone. Over time, my parents grew concerned that the house was causing a strain on our marriage, so they decided to gift it to us. When I arrived and saw my father taking his daily handful of pills, I swallowed my pride and kept my troubles to myself. My parents were getting older, and telling them about an illegitimate child would be too much of a shock. I made up an excuse to delay the transfer of the property deed. My dad looked puzzled, but didn't question my decision. When I got back home, Helen greeted me with a wide smile, but her tone was laced with insinuation. "Well, the big shot has returned. You've been off the grid all day. It's a good thing our dear Daniel was here to help me." I didn't even look up from my phone. "Must be nice. Some of us have to work so that papers don't just magically fall into place." Sarah, who had just come home, seemed cheered by my presence and rushed over to take my bag. Her mother, however, was less patient. "Is all the paperwork done?" she asked eagerly, her voice much sweeter than before. "Can Daniel be added to our household registration now?" I glanced at her and hummed softly. "Do you think these government departments are your family's business? You can't just add someone's name without any issues. You couldn't find anyone to help, so I had to call in a lot of favors." My sharp reply left both Sarah and her mother looking slightly offended. In the past, I had always been accommodating, carefully navigating around their fragile egos and never boasting about the things I did for them. As a result, they had started to take everything for granted. Sarah quickly regained her composure, acting as if nothing had happened, and gestured for everyone to sit down. "Alex, these procedures can't be wrapped up in a day or two." I sat on the sofa, tiredly rolling my neck, and began the speech I had prepared. "Even my friend Mike said this won't be easy. He estimates it will cost some money to pull the right strings." This was a necessary lie. Sarah had done her own research into adoption procedures and knew they were complicated, especially when the child still had living relatives. She didn't doubt my story for a second. "How much will it cost?" she asked. "$500,000? "What?" Helen was the first to react, jumping to her feet in anger. "Is he robbing us? Why would such a small thing cost so much? Isn't he your friend? Is he just trying to scam you?" Although Sarah didn't say anything, her silence was a clear sign of agreement with her mother. I couldn't help but let out a small chuckle. In my past life, Mike had spent a considerable amount of his own money to help me with this process, and I had shielded Sarah and her mother from the financial stress by covering all the costs myself. Not this time. "Forget it then, if it's too expensive," I said. "Mike doesn't even want the money. It's for greasing the wheels with various officials. If you don't want to pay, we can just raise the child as he is. Why bother with all the formalities?" The $500,000 figure was a number I had chosen deliberately. Most of our joint savings were tied up in long-term investments and term deposits, and we couldn't access them easily. We didn't have that much liquid cash. This money was Helen's personal savings, her retirement fund. She had never held a formal job and had no pension. Ever since she moved in with us, she had constantly lamented her unfortunate circumstances, often comparing herself to my parents, who had substantial pensions and a comfortable retirement ahead of them. Even when Sarah and I assured her that we would always take care of her, she would walk around with a gloomy expression. Eventually, Sarah convinced me that we should give her mother a monthly allowance of $10,000, framing it as payment for her help around the house and our way of being dutiful children. I hadn't been keen on the idea, but after their coordinated and persistent efforts, I had relented. After all, with our combined incomes, $1,000 a month wasn't going to bankrupt us. As a result, Helen had managed to save up a tidy sum. Now it was time for me to pry that money out of her hands. I left the three of them sitting in the living room with varying expressions of shock and anger, and retreated to the bedroom. I pulled out my phone and checked Sarah's activity again. She still hadn't sent any messages to the man named Mark. I decided it was time for a visit to her office. The next morning, breakfast was tense. I recalled how in my past life, Daniel had already started working hard to win me over after I had agreed to the adoption. This time, however, after my consistently detached responses, he barely dared to speak in my presence. Helen watched him with pity, piling his plate high with food at every meal. He was never allowed to leave the table until he was uncomfortably full. I simply watched the scene unfold with a smug sense of detachment, never intervening. Back when we first brought Daniel home in my previous life, I had taken him for a comprehensive health checkup. The doctor had warned me that his blood sugar was dangerously high and that if we didn't manage his diet carefully, he could develop diabetes, requiring lifelong insulin injections and potentially stunting his growth. I took the doctor's advice very seriously, enforcing a strict, healthy diet and a regular exercise routine for Daniel. High-calorie foods like cake and fried chicken were forbidden. I even signed him up for basketball and swimming lessons, which he enjoyed. But in Helen's eyes, my actions were seen as cruel, depriving the child of good food or even mistreating him. She was convinced that children couldn't get diabetes and that doctors were just fear-mongering to make money. Daniel seemed to be scared of me too, and even Sarah occasionally voiced her complaints. But for the sake of the child's health, I had patiently explained the situation over and over again. Eventually, while Helen remained skeptical, Sarah came to believe me to some extent. Under my careful guidance, Daniel had grown up to be a healthy boy. Remembering all this, I glanced over at Daniel, who was currently stuffing his face with fried chicken and sugary drinks, and then I looked away. In this lifetime, I had no intention of interfering. I would simply watch and see what became of Daniel under their brand of love and care. Before I left for work, Sarah stopped me. She told me that she and her mother had discussed it the previous night and had decided to come up with the $500,000. "It's just that our money is all tied up in the bank," she said, her face pleading, hinting that I should take the lead as I had done so many times before, perhaps by using my own money or asking my parents for help. In the past, she had masterfully maneuvered me into paying for countless things: a sick relative in her hometown, a new car, an expensive gift for her boss. She had burned through my personal savings in no time. But now, I just stared back at her in silence. Noticing my lack of response, she complained slightly. "We can't ask Mom for all that money, can we? It was so hard for her to save it." "Then forget it," I said flatly. "Regardless of the household registration, he's still your son, isn't he?" I let the hint hang in the air. Sarah hesitated, and I pressed my advantage. "You need to consider the finances carefully. I have to give Mike an answer by today." By that afternoon, Sarah called. She said that she and her mother had agreed to use Helen's $500,000 in savings first, with the promise that they would repay her once our investments matured. I happily agreed. Of course, they wouldn't be waiting that long. At noon, I left work early and headed to Sarah's office building. In my previous life, she had used my family's connections and resources to climb the corporate ladder in the financial world, eventually becoming a general manager. They say you shouldn't get into finance without a strong family backing, but Sarah was determined. Before she met me, she was on the verge of being fired for poor performance. I had reached out to my friends and family, asking them to bring their business to her to help stabilize her position. And in the end, she had repaid my kindness with betrayal. During the lunch break, I walked straight to Sarah's desk. She looked surprised to see me. It had been nearly 3 years since I had last visited her at work. In the early days of our marriage, I would often come by to have lunch with her or to meet clients with her. I remembered her saying something like, "Alex, When I know you're coming for lunch, I can't focus on my work at all. You're my biggest distraction." Her affectionate words had worked on me, and I had stopped interrupting her workdays. Now, seeing me so unexpectedly, a fleeting look of panic crossed her face, but she quickly composed herself. "What are you doing here?" she asked. "Can't I visit my own wife?" I retorted. Her face immediately smoothed into a nervous smile. "Of course. I'm just surprised. Let's go get some lunch." She was eager to leave the office, but I wasn't going to make it that easy for her. "No need," I said. "I already ordered delivery. It should be here any minute. Let's eat in the downstairs lounge." Many employees ate their lunch there. Once we were seated, Sarah asked again why I had come. "Checking up on you," I said with a grin. She chuckled awkwardly. "I'd welcome it." The lounge quickly filled up, and soon I spotted Mark sitting not too far away from us. Sarah seemed calm, though she occasionally glanced in his direction. I raised my voice just enough to be heard by the surrounding tables. "So, aren't you pregnant, though?" At a nearby table, Mark dropped his spoon with a clatter. Sarah instinctively looked over at him, but quickly snapped her head back. People around us turned to look, but Sarah didn't dare meet their gaze. Her poker face was good, but it didn't fool me. She leaned in close, whispering furiously, "Alex, I'm not pregnant." "I was just teasing," I whispered back, feigning confusion. Her perfectly sculpted features twisted in a slight grimace. Satisfied with what I had learned, I turned my attention back to my meal. That man was definitely Mark. Sarah got home late that evening, likely having spent hours explaining the situation to him. I, on the other hand, had had a very productive afternoon. I had arranged for Helen to withdraw the $500,000 in cash for me, and I had gathered a substantial amount of information on Mark. He was a finance officer at Sarah's company, a position that often came with a strict policy against inter-office dating, while Sarah was in the marketing department. Later that night at dinner, Helen was unusually quiet, looking deeply concerned. It wasn't until she was holding her grandson that she let out a long sigh, lamenting the $500,000 they had saved up being wiped out in an instant. "We poor folks work so hard for so long," she moaned, clearly hoping I would offer to get the money from my parents and eventually pay her back. I quipped, "Well, it's your grandkid. You'd think you'd be willing to spend a little more on him." Seeing her face fall, I feigned innocence and turned to Daniel. "Your grandma spent so much money on you. She's really hurting now." The little boy looked confused and on the verge of tears. Helen rushed to comfort him, denying my teasing words. I chuckled at the chaos I had created and left them to it. The day before Valentine's Day, Sarah announced that she had to travel for work and wouldn't be back that night. I was well aware that it was Mark's birthday. Last year he had posted on social media about not wanting to spend his next birthday alone. I remembered that at the time I had invited Sarah to a piano concert, but she had claimed she needed to chase a big client late into the night. I, being the supportive husband, had let her go, even promising to help her secure another major deal to make up for it. So this year, she was undoubtedly going to spend Mark's birthday with him. "Don't worry, I'll be back in time for Valentine's Day," she assured me, as I smiled and waved her out the door. That night, Mark's social media updated with a post expressing gratitude and subtle happiness. On Valentine's Day, even before Sarah had returned, I saw the photos. Pictures of her and Mark together, dressed like a couple, staying at a hotel, looking blissfully happy. I had thought that seeing such concrete evidence would fill me with anger or pain, but it didn't. When I actually saw it all laid out before me, I felt completely calm. I finally understood that all my sadness and anger had transformed into a cold, hard hatred after the car accident in my past life. All I wanted now was for them to pay. Daniel's adoption papers finally came through. With a bit of careful maneuvering and some misleading information, the neighbors didn't assume that it was Sarah and I who had adopted him. Just as in my previous life, Helen was outside playing with the child near the kindergarten when I returned home. "The papers are all sorted out, right?" She greeted me with a relieved smile. "That's wonderful. I was just telling everyone that I'm finally a grandmother." I had previously told her to keep quiet about the adoption until everything was official, so she wouldn't jinx it. She had managed to restrain herself until today. Helen was beaming, urging me to show the official residency proof to our gathered neighbors. But as soon as we unfolded the document, her expression changed dramatically. In the column for Mother, her name, Helen, was clearly written. What is this?" she stammered. I feigned surprise. "Oh, maybe the staff made a mistake. How could they list you as his mother? We should get them to fix this. This isn't right." Helen was visibly anxious. I put on a concerned look and added, "It might not be easy to change, though. Plus, it could take a lot of time. Daniel needs to be enrolled for the spring semester soon, and any delay might affect that. Can't we just let it be for now? We're all family, after all." The neighbors began to chime in. "That's right. It's just an adoption. Whether he's listed under you or your daughter doesn't really matter." Another added, "Actually, putting him under your name is better. It avoids any potential complications for your son-in-law and daughter when they have their own children." Honestly, they had always found it a bit odd that a young couple would adopt a child anyway. This new twist actually made more sense to them, but Helen kept insisting, "It's just not right." I teased her, "What's wrong? Are you too young to be a grandma?" The friendly neighbors laughed. One of them brought Daniel over from the playground. "Hey, kiddo, this is your mom now." Daniel, who had been getting noticeably chubbier lately, looked up, completely puzzled as to how his grandma had suddenly become his mom. Just then, Sarah returned from work. A neighbor pointed at her and said, "Look, your sister is home too." As Sarah stood there, her face a mask of utter shock, I had to physically restrain myself from bursting out laughing. After the public drama subsided, it was just the three of them back in the house. It seemed I was the only one in a good mood. My falsely cheerful attitude did little to dispel the tense atmosphere. Grandson had become son, and son had become brother. Naturally, they couldn't process such a bizarre and humiliating switch. "Let's just get him started in school first," I said, trying to comfort them. "We can sort out the paperwork later." They were clearly unhappy, but they had little choice in the matter. After that day, Helen was reluctant to take Daniel out in public anymore. If she did, people would coax the boy to call her Mom, leading to incredibly awkward situations. Sarah also started avoiding going out with Daniel, a stark contrast to the eager, doting mother she had pretended to be in the past, always taking him to school or to the amusement park. The reason for this drastic change wasn't just about the names, however. It also had to do with her work. That evening, Sarah came home looking exhausted. After a long hesitation, she finally broke the silent treatment she had been giving me since the paperwork issue arose. I knew exactly why she had come to me. She had started losing big clients who were connected to me through people I had once considered friends. "Alex, aren't they your friends? Can you talk to them for me?" she asked. I shook my head. "Didn't you ask me not to interfere with your job?" So I stopped contacting them. "I thought you were managing just fine on your own," I added, twisting the knife. She had once eagerly benefited from my connections, but had later grown resentful, fearing people would say she relied on her husband. Now she needed my help again. My words made her face turn sour, and she left the room in frustration. She was under immense pressure, vying for a vice president position, and with her client base disappearing, she looked utterly worn out. So I decided it was time to give her a truly significant gift. I told Sarah that I had arranged a meeting for her with an important client at her workplace. She readily agreed to let me accompany her. When we arrived at her office, I could tell from the strange looks and hushed whispers from her colleagues that my gift had already been delivered. Oblivious, Sarah was still smirking at her coworkers. "Cover for me in the meeting later," she said. "I have a major client to entertain." A coworker glanced at me and whispered to her, "Did your brother-in-law send them?" Sarah's face showed a flash of annoyance. She hated admitting any reliance on her husband. Finally, a male colleague couldn't stand it any longer. He pulled a stack of photographs from a wastebasket and slammed them down on the table. "Some people climb the corporate ladder using their husband's connections and then cheat on him. It's repugnant." "What are you talking about?" Sarah snapped. "The photos are plastered everywhere, even in company-wide emails, and you're still denying it?" he said, scattering the photos across the table before walking away. By this point, Sarah realized something was terribly wrong. As she looked at the colorful, mocking expressions on her co-workers' faces, a wave of dread washed over her. Peering down at the floor, she saw what they were all looking at. Photos of her and Mark in various intimate moments. She couldn't bring herself to meet anyone's eyes. It felt as if time had stopped, until her boss arrived, summoning her to his office with a tone that was anything but friendly. The spell was broken. I maintained a shattered, heartbroken demeanor, metaphorically slapping her across the face before grabbing my car keys and walking out, leaving her to face the solemn, pitying stares of her colleagues. I drove straight to my parents' house and told them everything. Sarah had been unfaithful. She had a secret child, and we were getting a divorce. They were shocked, but seeing my calm and level-headed demeanor, they chose to give me their full support. I sent Sarah the official divorce papers, along with a copy of a paternity test that proved she and Daniel were mother and son. Then, I cut off all contact. I had no interest in her apologies, and certainly didn't want to hear her excuses. I knew she wouldn't agree to the divorce easily. She had nothing without me. She wouldn't even have a place to live, but as her clients continued to abandon her and her career prospects crumbled, she realized she had no other choice. She finally contacted me, agreeing to the divorce. I arranged to meet her at the city divorce office. On the day, my friends and family came with me for support. It had been a while since I had last seen Sarah. She was no longer the confident, polished woman I had married. I watched her get off the bus, looking disheveled and worn, her clothes messy. I realized it was because I had taken our car. When she saw me, she was silent for a long time before finally forcing out a few tears. "Alex, I'm so sorry. Can you please just listen to my explanation? Daniel was just an accident." She was still trying to salvage the situation, but I had no patience for it. "Enough, let's just sign the papers." We stood there, she hesitating. I smirked. "What, you have a problem with the settlement?" "Alex, we've been married for 7 years. Do you really have to be this ruthless?" she pleaded. "The agreement says I leave with nothing." "What else do you think you deserve?" I retorted. "The house belongs to my parents. The car belongs to them, too. You have been secretly using our shared assets to support your lover and your illegitimate child for years. You should be grateful I'm not suing you for damages." My voice wasn't quiet, and people around us began to stare at Sarah with open disdain. "But, no buts. If you sign these papers, I will stay out of your client affairs." She was only here because she was desperate. The cheating scandal had destroyed any chance she had for the VP position, as her company had a strict policy banning office romances. Mark had been forced to quit to protect his own career. Her entire family was now relying on her, and the few high-end clients she had left were all connected to me. The pressure I was applying gave her no choice but to show up. She didn't want to lose me as a source of money, but her company had given her an ultimatum: deliver results by the end of the month, or face a pay cut, or even termination. Eventually, she signed. We were officially divorced. After we received the divorce certificates, she tried to speak to me again. I raised my hand and slapped her hard across the face. "This is for what you owe me." Stunned by the sudden violence, her first instinct when she saw me raise my hand again was to fight back, but my friends held her down. The second slap landed squarely. "This is for what you owe my parents." And then a third. "This one is for being heartless." Afterward, I noticed my hand was shaking. In the midst of the chaos, Helen and Daniel arrived, along with Mark. It quickly devolved into a huge commotion, with Helen screaming the loudest. She cried and yelled for me to return her $500,000. "50 grand? I have no idea what you're talking about," I said calmly. "I made sure you withdrew the cash yourself with your own card. How is that my problem?" Helen realized she had been tricked and tried to lunge at me, but she was held back. Mark then decided to chime in. "You're too much. I know you hate us. You've been calculating since day one, taking all her money, and now you're stealing from an old lady too? Aren't you afraid of karma?" His appearance didn't faze me in the slightest. There was no way I was letting him off the hook. A moment later, a red handprint bloomed on his cheek as well. "What I took was mine. Without me, she is nothing but a pauper. If you cherish her so much, you can keep her." He tried to speak again, but someone yanked him back by his hair, and he yelped in pain. The scene became chaotic once more, until security arrived and separated us. By the end of it, every member of Sarah's family was bruised and disheveled. Sarah pointed a trembling finger at me, her voice filled with a mixture of hatred and dawning realization. "Ben, you knew about Daniel all along, didn't you? You're really something else, going through all of this just to make sure I leave with absolutely nothing." "I just returned you to where you came from," I replied coldly. "Back to having nothing, just like before you met me. But even this isn't enough. I knew they wouldn't leave the house willingly, so I sold it at a steep discount to a property agency known for its aggressive tactics. They sent a team over, trashed all of their belongings, threw them out onto the street, and warned them never to come back. The entire eviction was a huge spectacle, which someone filmed and posted online. It went viral, stirring up even more public discussion about them. Homeless, they were forced to move into Sarah's cramped company dormitory, a space under 200 square feet, now squeezing in 4 people. It was a miserable existence, but they had no other options. I occasionally checked in on Sarah's phone using the software I had installed. I found out that she rarely went back to the dorm these days. Mark had become hysterical, constantly arguing with her about their family and money problems. Helen now called Mark a curse, blaming him for their downfall. Mark, in turn, fought back, manipulating Daniel and turning him against his own grandmother. Sarah was caught in the middle of it all, miserable. She even started writing me letters, begging for a reconciliation. But soon, she would be longing for the noisy, chaotic life she currently had. What major financial company doesn't have a few skeletons in its closet, especially with the massive cash flows and high-stakes deals involved? I anonymously sent evidence of Sarah's wrongdoing, bribery, tax fraud through falsified expense reports, to her company's headquarters. After an investigation was ordered from HQ, the local branch, eager to find a scapegoat, quickly pointed their fingers at Mark, the finance guy. Their shady relationship had already raised suspicions of illicit dealings. When they were both arrested, I, with my family's full support, also filed a police report. I suspected that Sarah and Mark had conspired to commit insurance fraud. I had unknowingly been the holder of 2 accidental death policies, both of which named Sarah as the sole beneficiary. As proof, I even provided Sarah's secondary secret phone number. I had discovered her second line when I noticed there was zero communication between her and Mark on her regular phone. I knew she must be using a different method to keep their plans quiet. After gathering evidence, the police quickly confirmed that the two of them had committed the crime. Their private phone contained detailed plans about how to kill me and make it look like an accident in order to collect the insurance money. The police showed me their complete chat history. Because of what I already knew from my past life, I was certain they had been plotting for a long time. What I hadn't known was that they had already tried to kill me once before, back when Daniel was just born. I had miraculously survived that attempt, which had made them more cautious the second time. Reading through their fragmented chat logs, everything became horrifyingly clear. How the two of them met was quite simple. Back then, Sarah had just married me. I was more educated and came from a wealthier family, and she felt insecure and inferior. She had chosen to marry me thinking it would save her 20 years of struggle, but the teasing from her friends about marrying for money had gotten under her skin. So when her new co-worker, Mark, showed an interest in her, she took the bait. She kept a lover on the side, thinking it somehow put her on equal footing with me, or even above me. The countless chat records showed her repeatedly mocking my naivety to Mark. But when Mark wanted to make their relationship official, she had flatly refused. She bluntly told him that she had married me to secure access to my family's wealth, and that my affluent parents would never let her go easily. That's when their vicious plan to murder me was born. When I finally left the police station, it felt like an eternity had passed. Everything was finally settled. I didn't attend Sarah and Mark's sentencing. My father later told me that they had both broken down in tears in the courtroom, blaming each other, each claiming they had been bewitched by the other. They painted the other as the mastermind, completely ignoring courtroom decorum and screaming profanities at one another. Meanwhile, I was preparing to move abroad. I had been offered a significant promotion and a raise, but it required transferring to the company's overseas headquarters. In the past, I had given up similar opportunities for the sake of my family, but now I was determined to seize this chance for myself. My parents were already retired and decided to move abroad with me. When I heard the sentences for Sarah and Mark, life imprisonment and 15 years, respectively, I felt nothing. They got what they deserved. Before leaving the country, I took my parents for a final medical checkup. By a strange twist of fate, we ran into Helen and Daniel at the hospital. Daniel had transformed into a short, dark, and pudgy child. A complete contrast to the energetic, healthy boy he had been under my care. Helen looked noticeably older and haggard. She was in the middle of causing a scene, yelling at a doctor and accusing the hospital of trying to scam her. She vehemently denied the possibility that Daniel could have diabetes. Her words angered the doctor, who sternly warned her that Daniel's condition was severe and that without immediate treatment, it could be life-threatening. A bystander, seeing me watching them, kindly filled me in on the details. She said the two of them had been there several times. Initially, it was because Daniel had suddenly started vomiting and fainted. After running tests, the doctor had diagnosed him, but they refused to believe it. This time, his condition had worsened. He had collapsed on the street and had been brought in by a good Samaritan. The police had even been involved. The bystander added that their relationship was bizarre. The woman looked old enough to be his grandmother, and the boy even called her that, but when the police checked their official documents, they were listed as mother and son. The onlooker guessed they weren't from a decent family. I just smiled politely and remained silent, watching as Helen finally conceded, slinking away with Daniel in tow. It didn't take much imagination to know that they wouldn't pursue proper treatment. Helen had been ignorant of the dangers before, and even if she understood now, they likely couldn't afford the medical bills anyway. As for what would happen to that child in the future, it was no longer my concern. After finishing the checkups with my parents and confirming they were both in good health, I quickly booked our plane tickets. Sitting on the airplane, looking out the window at the vast blue sky, I felt a long-held fog of darkness finally begin to lift from inside me. As the plane slowly ascended, leaving the ground and the city behind, I knew that the events of the past should no longer occupy my thoughts. My future was now a blank canvas, vast and full of endless possibilities.